Okay, we're going to do a little bit of Q&A, and I'm going to ask Sharon, would you mind walking the mic to people who raise their hand? Sharon in the back, yeah, she's coming. And I'm going to start off the first question, and I'm going to ask this of Randal. Federal gas taxes built the interstate system. When the system was completed in the 1980s, 20% of our gas tax was diverted to transit. What do you think we should do with the federal gas tax?
Well, I think we should eliminate all gas taxes and replace them. We should eliminate all gas taxes and replace them with mileage-based user fees. Can you hear me anyway? Yeah. Oregon was the first state to impose a gas tax and dedicate the money to roads. And it was an innovation. In those days, toll roads were very expensive. It was collecting the tolls required human collectors, and more than half the money you collected went to the cost of collection. And so gas taxes had a cheap cost of collection, and it made sense to use. But the problem with gas taxes is that they don't tell you which highways are expensive. They don't tell the people who are providing the highways where people want to go and when they want to go there. So they're not really a good tax. It's like a good user fee. It's like if you're a dairy and you get money each month for what you produce, but you don't know whether people are buying your ice cream or your cheese or your cream or what, so you don't know what to produce. So you end up overproducing some things and underproducing other things. You need to have that feedback. And mileage-based user fees can provide that feedback. Oregon is now the first state to be experimenting with mileage-based user fees. They have a system that protects your privacy. The state has no idea where you're going. They only know that you're paying money. And I was one of the first volunteers, I know because they opened it up at midnight on July 1st in 2015, and at 12:01 I submitted my application, online application, to be a volunteer in their mileage-based user fee program. And every month I get a bill that tells me how many miles I've driven in Oregon. If I leave the state, it doesn't count, it only counts in the state. And they refund me my gas taxes, and then I pay 1.5 cents for every mile I drive. And what I've learned is I don't pay much tax because I just give them $20 every few months, and it doesn't seem to add up very fast. So really the fee is very low. Privacy is absolutely guaranteed. The state has no idea where I'm going or when I'm going there, and I think that's the way we should pay for roads in the future. That means if you want to have a private road, you can latch onto this system and have private roads. And you will have the cities, the counties, the states, the federal government, and private road providers all competing with one another to provide roads and get your business. That would be the way to have more roads, not the way we have it today, where, as Will Rogers supposedly once said, if we want to relieve congestion, the way to do it is to have private companies build the roads and have the government build cars.
Okay, Sharon, Deanna believes has a question.
I have a question. My question is, what determines what that gas tax is actually going for? Because it seems to me like in the last couple of years, they approved a bicycle trail from Pinellas County all the way to Merritt Island. And that was a multi-million-dollar boondoggle coming out of the gas tax.
Well, it's different in every state. In Oregon, 0.5% of gas taxes collected by the state goes to bike paths. The other 99.5% must only go for highways, roads, and streets. However, it doesn't say that it has to go to improve highways, roads, and streets. So they do things that they call like complete streets or boulevarding, or they have different terms for it, road diets. But they're spending gas tax money on streets. They're spending it to reduce the capacity of the streets, but it's being spent on the streets. So that's not a good thing. So what I would propose is that every state, you use your initiative petition process or something like that to pass a constitutional amendment in your state to say that gas taxes, tolls, and mileage-based user fees can only go for highway improvements, and they can't go for capacity reductions, only to maintain and improve the capacity of existing roads. And that way, you'd have some assurance. Now, Texas spends half of their gas tax money on education. Massachusetts spends half of their gas tax money on transit. So we need to have these constitutional amendments to make sure that that doesn't happen.
I'm skeptical about driverless as being the wave of the future in solving a lot of transportation problems. I just wrote down some bullets, and I wish you could respond to them. Technological devices, there are a lot of problems right now. Hacking and viruses, failures of software, bugs and crashes. With cars and so on, you have a huge pattern recognition problem. You've got dangerous, fast-moving, multi-motion environments. And so it seems to me that some of our existing technology has lots of bugs and glitches. I wouldn't want to be in front of a driverless car.
Well, if you go down to your car dealer today and buy a car, if it's a moderate to upper end car, it already has more computer power in it than a Boeing 777. There are like over 100 computer processors in your car, and they're each dedicated to doing something. The reason why your home computer crashes a lot is because it has a generalized processor, and you're using it to do artwork, to do word processing, to do page layout, to do Facebook, to do all kinds of different things. And you've got a generalized processor. With cars, each processor is specifically made for a specific task, is specifically programmed to do that specific task, and so they don't crash, they don't stop running. So you aren't even aware of this. You're driving your car, your automatic, your anti-lock brakes are run by a processor, your accelerator is run by a processor. When you push your foot on the accelerator pedal, that doesn't send gas to the engine. It sends a signal to a computer to then send gas to the engine, and then send the right amount of air, so you get the right combination of air and gas, and so on and so forth. So it's all electronically done, and with driverless cars, we're just taking the next step. I would be skeptical about them too if we didn't have so much experience with them. I've been inside of a driverless car riding around downtown Washington, D.C. If anything, the only problem with the car was that it was more timid than an ordinary driver. So when we were merging traffic with other traffic, this car was letting all the other cars in rather than being aggressive like I would do and force my way in. But that can be programmed in too if you want it to. And if most of the cars on the road are driverless, there's going to be a lot less congestion. Even if only as few as 5% of cars on the road are driverless, it's going to start relieving congestion right there, because a lot of congestion is caused by slow human reflexes. When some cars on the road have computer reflexes, it's going to interrupt the delays caused by slow human reflexes, and we'll have a lot less congestion. So we'll see, maybe I'm just being optimistic, but more than 50 different companies are doing research on this, and they're competing against each other. We have at least half a dozen multi-billion-dollar companies that are spending $1 billion a year to be the first on the streets. General Motors, Ford, Volkswagen, Waymo, Uber, and so on and so forth. And somebody's going to figure it out. And when they do, transit is cooked.
Glenn? Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. I'm glad that you mentioned the VMT. When you start talking VMT to our local Floridians here, they immediately go Big Brother mode, another tax, we don't want anything to do with it. And unfortunately, the way of the world cannot be changed. Electric cars are reality as more and more vehicles become electrically driven as opposed to gas driven. That funding model for vehicles has a tendency to decline through time and will result in either raises in the gas tax or just all these funding shortfalls. What I've been trying to encourage is a conversation in which we can introduce products which are universally applicable to each of us in our own situations, which will produce jobs and solve problems. One of these types of products is a digital license plate. The license plate on your car that you've had is basically the same one that was issued in 1910. It's a stamped piece of metal with government revenue involved, and you're official for the next year or whatever. A digital license plate could incorporate a number of different technologies to solve some of these problems, not the least of which would be that vehicle mileage tax. Has this been your experience in Oregon? Can you enlighten us with some of the technological appurtenances that are applicable to the VMT?
Well, there's actually several different ways of collecting a vehicle mile fee or a mileage-based user fee. One of which is what you're talking about. In Oregon, we have at least 3 different technologies in use, and maybe 4, because you have your choice of provider. Basically what happens is there's an intermediary company that collects your data, and then they transmit your money to the state. So the intermediary company might know where I'm going, but the state doesn't know where I'm going. That's how my privacy is protected. And so you have your choice of providers. What I did is I got a little GPS device that plugs into the diagnostic port on my car. And so it's transmitting my GPS coordinates to this intermediate company. Now it doesn't have to be a device like that. It could be as something as like a smartphone. You could just get an app on your smartphone, and then when you get in a car with your friend, somebody has to decide which app is going to be made live to pay for the driving. And that way it's not connected to the car at all, it's connected to the people. And again, you can have your privacy protected, and you can have your choice of providers. Just like when you're using maps, you can choose between Google Maps and Apple Maps and TomTom and Garmin and so on. But when you choose one of those, you're not only getting information from those companies, you're transmitting information to the companies. So when you use a Google map, for example, and it shows you that particular routes are really congested, it shows routes in red and other routes are yellow because they're moderately congested, that's because it's getting that information from other people who are using Google Maps. So there is a two-way communication, but you can protect your privacy in various ways and choose a provider who you think will do the best to protect your privacy if that's an important concern to you. So there's a lot of ways of going about it. I'm open to having as many ways as possible, and the state of Oregon seems to be open to it because they have 4 different providers available right now, and I'd like to see even more. Now, I do want to say the state of Washington did it differently. The state of Washington handled it themselves. They asked people to volunteer, and then after people had volunteered for a month, they sent them a letter saying, you speeded so many times that if we had caught you every time you speeded using your GPS device, we would have sent you a bill for $70,000 in speeding tickets. Now that doesn't really sound like we're doing very good a job of protecting privacy. I don't like that model. I like the Oregon model, and I encourage other states to emulate.
Hi. Just in the sake of transparency, I am not into transportation as much as everybody else. John is my uncle, so I'm here to speak and support him. I have a bit of a different starting point of view from everybody else. So you both put on good presentations, and I thoroughly understand why you dislike what you dislike. That being said, people reproduce faster than they die. The population on the planet is increasing on a daily basis. It'd be nice if everybody could have, a big house with a big yard and their own individual car. But the reality is, I live on Gandy and I work across the street. It's like 5 miles away. It takes me an hour to drive to work in the morning. What solutions do you propose? It's really easy to see what you don't like. How do we fix it?
I don't think there's any one solution, but I think certainly government-run transit monopolies are dying out for many of the reasons Randall talked about. And I think a variety of market-based pricing mechanisms, time of day use, road user fees, congestion pricing, as well as driverless cars, Uber, Lyft. So we need to shift away from government monopolies and invite as much market competition and innovation, technological development into the equation as possible. With regard to space, people have been predicting the environmental catastrophe. The genre of literature about catastrophic events regarding the coming shortages of things is pretty established. People have been predicting catastrophe for a very long time, limits to growth, etc. Generally speaking, that never works out. We don't really have a shortage of resources. We don't have a shortage of land. America used to be an oil importer, now we're an oil exporter. So I just think late great Julian Simon used to talk about, you know, the ultimate resource is human ingenuity, and I have a lot of faith in human ingenuity. And when you see the way that local regulators fought against the ride-hailing companies, Uber and Lyft, as they were in bed protecting the taxi cartels and the transit monopolists for years, and they were quickly swept aside by the millions of people with smartphones who preferred to simply call for a vehicle and not have to go out on Fifth Avenue and hail a cab. Those who tried to stand in the way of the Uber Lyft ride-hailing revolution quickly had to admit defeat. And I think we need to sort of Uberize the entire transportation economy, in my view, and that would help get us to the innovation that we need.
Randal?
I used to be concerned about population growth because the population bomb was written when I was in high school. I remember a friend of mine said, I read that book and I want to take a machine gun and start shooting people. And when I was in high school, I went to a junior legislature program in Salem, Oregon State Capitol, and I introduced a bill to mandate forced sterilization after people had 2 children. Since then, I've looked at the numbers and found, first of all, population growth is mainly happening in developing countries, and as people get more educated, they don't grow as fast. Population doesn't grow as fast. So the real solution to population growth is to help those developing countries become more developed, to educate their population, especially the women, because women who are educated and go into the workforce tend to have far fewer children than women who don't. So women's rights is an important part of population control. Second, I don't see population as being as big a problem as I once saw it. I once sat down and calculated that if we gave everybody in the world a queen-size bed and told them to lay them side by side, they'd all fit into one county in Oregon. Of course, Oregon has counties that are bigger than New Jersey, but still, that's quite a startling number. I think I also calculated that if you gave every family in the world a quarter-acre lot, they'd all fit in Kentucky. The population has grown a little bit. Now it might be Tennessee, I'm not sure. But the point is, at urban densities, we don't cover much land. The United States urban areas cover about 80 million acres, and that's about 3.5% of all the land in the country. And the lower 48, it doesn't even count Alaska. When you look at all the land that's being used for growing crops, and you say, oh, we're worried about urban sprawl covering up our croplands, and it turns out, well, our croplands have declined from 420 to 350 million acres since 1980. Why is that? Because our crop productivity is growing faster than our population growth. We don't need as much land. In fact, all the food Americans eat is grown on 77 million acres of land for the vegetables and fruits, and then another 120 million acres of land for growing the food that's consumed by the meats we eat. So about 200 million acres of land is all we need for growing crops anymore, and it's declining. So I'm not too worried about population growth. I'd like to see some control, just because I like to see more wilderness and more areas set aside, but we have much more serious problems than that.
Could I just do a little follow-up on that? I just looked it up on my little handy phone here, and the birth rate in the United States is going down. It's currently 1.84 per woman, and of course it takes 2 people for every one childbirth. So actually the population in the United States is steady or slightly declining. You do have immigration influx as well, so it may be about even. But there's also limited government resources, and you have to look at priorities. Are we going to invest in sewers, or are we going to invest in sidewalks? Are we going to invest in the power grid, or are we going to invest in subsidies to sports stadiums? So anyhow, I just wanted to throw that in there.
Karen, thanks. It's a great segue into my question, primarily for Mr. Charles, because of your Portland experience related to infrastructure. Portland is kind of hailed as this, just model for planning, and I've talked to people who've been out there, but I've never really gotten a good answer. Given your experience there, do you have any good examples of, or can you testify to, the state of infrastructure versus a lot of the transit improvements they made? Where here locally, the part of the battle is funding for infrastructure, as Karen just mentioned. So, but I'm curious to know, as a local person who's been there, have you seen infrastructure issues or funding issues that you can, point out? Thank you.
I think in general, whether it's Portland or any other place in the country, the more you can get government out of the way and have things financed by actual investors, you're going to get a lot more efficiency. For instance, if we abolished the Federal Transit Administration, which would be a good idea, and if we didn't allow any gas tax money to be sucked off at the federal level for transit projects, in fact, if there was no federal involvement at all in any growth activity of any locality, if there was no state involvement, if everything was to be financed locally, which was the case in much of the country, a century ago, most wasteful projects simply wouldn't happen. People do stupid things typically when they have access to what they think of as free money. And I've heard many people say, well, we're competing for that. If we don't get it, some other city will, so we should get our share. It's free. It came from Mars or some universe. And so I'd say in general, the bigger the unit of government, these regional governments that were referred to earlier, are typically a bad idea. State involvement, big multi-state authorities, federal involvement, all that stuff we should try and move away as quickly as possible. And when you have private investors risking their own money, you're going to have a lot sharper pencil going on, and you'll have money allocated to things that make sense. And the more we can get private investment and get governments out of the way, and I'm not dreaming of some libertarian utopia, I'm just saying as a practical matter, let's take the low-hanging fruit and have big projects financed primarily, not through general taxation, but through user fees. And when we talk about mileage-based user fees, congestion pricing, et cetera, we're talking about real-time collection of fees paid by users who benefit. And that, I'm in favor of user fees for almost any infrastructure service we can think of as opposed to taxation. And that would be a really good direction to move towards.
Randal, I'm just going to interject a quick question. Can you talk a little bit about fare box recoveries and where they should be, since John Charles mentioned user fees? Any comments you want to make on that?
Well, typically, transit agencies get about a third of their operating funds from fares, and of course 0% of their capital funds. And there's also a third kind of funding, which is called maintenance. You often hear people talk about operations and maintenance, but in the transit industry, maintenance is considered a capital cost, which it really isn't. But typically, the agencies depend on the federal government to pay for their capital cost, or most of their capital costs, and then they pay the operating cost, and nobody budgets for maintenance, which is why the transit industry has about a $100 billion maintenance backlog right now. The New York subway system, the Washington subway system, the Philadelphia rail system, the Boston and Chicago rail systems, and the San Francisco BART system all have multi-billion dollar, in some cases, multi-tens of billions of dollars of maintenance backlogs. They're saying they have to spend $37 billion to get the New York subway system up to par, $25 billion for the Washington, D.C. subway system. And that's because nobody budgeted for it. So we need to get away from the idea that transit should be subsidized. It should pay for itself. If it can't pay for itself, we don't need it. And highways can pay for themselves. There are highway subsidies, but they tend to be tiny. Most of the subsidies are local. And in response to the question about Portland streets are falling apart because they're neglecting the streets so they can build streetcars and things like that. The city has 5,000 miles of streets. They want to build 130 miles of streetcar lines. That 130 miles would cost as much as repaving all the 5,000 miles of streets. But they're going to build the streetcars before they repave the streets. In fact, they have no plans to do any street repaving for the next several years. That's still true, isn't it?
Probably.
It's been true. So again, we come down to user fees, as John said. If things are paid for out of user fees, the people who are collecting the money know that if they aren't providing a good resource for the users to use, they'll stop paying the fees. So they keep them well maintained. Our state highways, which are generally paid for out of user fees, are better maintained than local roads and streets, because the local roads and streets are generally paid for out of property taxes rather than user fees, and it's just easier to divert the property taxes to something else for a couple of years.
Okay, this will be our last question, and Jim?
Yeah, thank you. This is for both of you. This is for both of you, since you're both from Portland. And I understand that neither of you mentioned about congestion in transit. I think Jared Walker, the transit specialist from Portland, has stated that he doesn't know why politicians or people who are transit supporters even use that as a way to reduce congestion, because it doesn't. And I think Portland is now ranked number 12 by INREX and by the Texas A&M Mobility Study every year, where Tampa used to be the 12th. Tampa's actually gone down without transit, and Portland is actually increasing with transit and their congestion. The other thing they didn't talk about, and they refuse to talk about locally, is the gentrification and displacement that occurs around transit, particularly light rail. The people looking for affordable housing, workforce housing here locally, can't even get on the map with the transit people who are trying to support it. I think in Portland, they just passed a sales tax to pay for workforce housing and affordable housing in the city. So if you could both address gentrification and congestion around these things, it would be a great help.
Well, it's certainly true that by design, if they put a light rail line in or a transit line, they're going to upzone a region. Like I showed you the house that they wanted to tear down and put a 55 unit thing there. I have a friend of mine who's a developer, and he said, yeah, that's how it works. You know, we buy a house and we tear it down, and the person who sold it, they're happy, they got their money, we tear it down. We didn't want their house, we just wanted the land, and then we built up a 5-story stack and pack. But the economics of building that means it's by definition not actually going to be inexpensive. You are gentrifying the neighborhood, and you're also massively increasing the local traffic. I've heard Jared Walker speak a couple times, and he's an interesting guy, and he has some good things to say. It's certainly true that transit per se is not going to relieve congestion. I mean, on the type of transit you use, it's likely to be either have no effect or make congestion worse. I will say that in Portland, after dragging their heels for years, and despite many studies over 20 years showing that peak hour tolling of the highway system would have tremendous benefits to reducing traffic and actually increasing the per hour vehicle flow through our highway system would be good. We've been delaying, but as of 2017, there's a legislative mandate that the Oregon Transportation Commission, by the end of this year, must file an application to the feds for a waiver to put what they call value pricing, which is another term for congestion pricing, on one or both of two major interstates, I-205 or I-5, and I've worked on that, I've testified on it, and I would say the Oregon Transportation Commission, which is 5 people appointed by the governor, have really kind of gotten religion on this, and I would say they are looking, not just for one or two, they anticipate, I think 3 of the 5 anticipate, sometime in the next decade, the entire highway interconnected network will probably shift away from gas tax financing to complete ubiquitous electronic tolling, peak hour, variable rate pricing on existing lanes, not building new lanes necessarily right away, but on existing lanes to make them work better, to solve congestion. And I've encouraged them to think that way, because I do believe that really is the only way to reduce congestion. And by the way, then high occupancy vehicles, including if there's still bus service around, and vans and anything else that has more than one person in it, that can be the really big winners on free flowing highways. Suddenly transit becomes a lot more attractive if transit vehicles themselves are not stuck in bumper traffic.
John mentioned this, but I want to emphasize it because it isn't often mentioned when we talk about tolling. Highways can move, a freeway can move about 2,000 vehicles an hour on a single lane in free-flowing traffic. But when it gets congested, it slows down and the number of vehicles per hour declines. It can decline below 1,000 vehicles an hour. So if you can make sure it never gets congested, you can effectively double the number of cars that can move down a highway lane during rush hour without increasing capacity. So pricing can double the capacity of your rush hour road system. Pricing can double the capacity without spending any money at all, except for whatever it costs to get the pricing system going. That, to me, is a firm argument in favor of it. And anybody says, "Oh, I've already paid for the roads, I don't want to pay for them twice." Well, you're not paying for the roads because we're already subsidizing them. The local roads are being subsidized and so on. But this way, we'll make sure that you can get to where you want to go at 5 in the afternoon in the same amount of minutes as it would take you at 5 o'clock in the morning. And it helps everybody. So I think that the only real solution to congestion is variable pricing, whether through mileage-based user fees or electronic tolling. And anybody that says they want to solve congestion and isn't willing to use variable pricing isn't serious. Now, as for gentrification, if you build a BART system that moves hundreds of thousands of people and you put a station in a neighborhood, yes, it's going to gentrify that neighborhood. If you build a light rail station that moves thousands of people, or a light rail system that moves thousands of people, not hundreds of thousands, you put a light rail station in a neighborhood, it's not going to do anything to that neighborhood. It's not going to do anything. In fact, it might even drive development away from that neighborhood because of the crime problem that John Charles mentioned. The transit-oriented developments we see along the light rail are all subsidized. We subsidize the light rail, and then we subsidize the transit-oriented developments to get people to ride the light rail. So if you don't have the subsidies, you're not going to get any gentrification. So what we're talking about is double subsidies, and then you might get gentrification, which might be good or it might be bad. And in Portland, it hasn't been good at all because it's moved the poor people out into other places where they don't have the services available that Portland wants available.
Okay, and we are going to allow one more question who's already in the queue, and we do have some time built in for that. So, Dave?
Okay. Two things. One's a question in the Oregon pay per mile. Does it vary based on the weight of the vehicle, which is what's destroying the road, or is this a fixed rate? And then I would like to just comment on this congestion-based pricing. I really think this is a bad idea. I mean, this is Big Brother again, trying to tell people how to live their lives. And all you're going to do is raise the tolls for people who commute into a city, which is probably going to drive industry out, or just going to raise the cost of living for people. It's never worked where the government has controlled people's behavior. So I really don't think congestion-based pricing will work. But anyway, to the question about the vehicle weight, I would think that if you were going to charge per mile, you should do it based on the weight of the vehicle. And do they do that in Oregon?
Oregon is the only state, I believe, that has a weight mile tax for trucks. So heavy trucks pay a higher fee than everybody else. But it turns out that the damage done to the roads is not based on the weight of the vehicle, but based on the tire pressure of their tires. Heavy trucks might have tires that have, 200 pounds per square inch, whereas your car tires are typically around 30 or 40 pounds per square inch. So a Lincoln Navigator doesn't cause any more damage to the road than a Toyota Prius. And at least that's what the state of Oregon has calculated, is included. So it's the same fee for a Lincoln Navigator as a Toyota Prius. If you're driving a semi-truck, then it's a much higher fee. Now, as for congestion pricing, I don't think of it as Big Brother when if I decide to fly somewhere on the day before Thanksgiving, the airline charges me more than if I decide to fly somewhere on some day that nobody else is flying. I don't think of it as Big Brother as if I come down to a Florida hotel in the middle of winter, that the hotel charges me more than if I stay at that hotel in the middle of summer. That's a natural market response. When the demand is higher, you charge more to make sure that you don't get an overflow. And with highways, we need to do the same thing. When the demand is higher, we charge more, and we get the added benefit. This hotel doesn't lose rooms in the winter. It has the same number of rooms in the winter as in the summer. The airplanes have the same number of seats the day before Thanksgiving as they do on Thanksgiving Day, when nobody's flying. But when you're driving on a highway, if the flow goes way down because you're not tolling, because you've allowed it to become congested instead, then by tolling, by having variable pricing, we're essentially pricing people onto the road. We're not pricing them off the road, we're pricing them onto the road by doubling the capacity of the roads during rush hour. And it's clear, the data are clear, that when the roads are congested, you can't move as many vehicles an hour, half as many or less. So congestion pricing can toll people onto the roads, The Reason Foundation has a great video. Drew, what's his name? Drew Carey. Drew Carey is a libertarian, and so he's done some videos for Reason Foundation. He had a great video for a variable priced road in California. And to go from one end to the other on the road cost $9 or something. And they asked somebody who wasn't rich how he felt about having to pay $9. And he said, well, my kids are in daycare. I have 2 kids in daycare. And they charge me $2 a minute per kid for every minute I'm late picking them up. So it's worth it to pay $9 to go get there on time.
That's the excuse that I've heard. Everybody gives that same excuse. But, oh, I got to pick up my kids, so I'm willing to pay the extra money. That's the standard answer everybody gives.
But the point is, if they charge
People who
everybody,
live in Pasco County, who work in Tampa, are not going to change their lives because they have to pay more money. They're just going to lose money.
but we're talking about essentially no gas taxes, paying for the roads through a mileage-based user fee, and letting that fee vary during congested periods so that the roads never get congested.
It won't work, is what I'm telling you. People still have
I
to drive
believe-
to work.
I believe it is working in Miami. Do they have? No, we'll go there. Okay, I'm going to let John Charles make his comment. We are going to, after he's done, we are going to have maybe a 2-minute changeover. So if you need to use a bathroom break, if you want to get a drink, we have drinks over in the back. That would be your time to do that. And John Charles.
The cost of delay already exists. So you can either barter your time, sitting in traffic, going nowhere, and it's very egalitarian. It's kind of a Soviet thing. Comrade, we're all sitting, wasting our time equally. Isn't that great? Or you can just pay cash at whatever speed you're going, because there are no toll gates involved anymore in this whole thing. So either pay cash or pay time. It's all the same. Recently, before we testified at the Transportation Commission hearing in Portland, I placed 6 of us throughout the length of about a 25-mile highway at different places, and we knew that the optimal traffic flow would be about 33 vehicles per lane per minute. That would give you about a 50-mile-per-hour ride. And the highway itself varies from 2 lanes to 3 lanes to 4 lanes, depending on where you are. So I had people from here, all up here to the end, all the way to the Washington State border. So during this 2-hour period of 3 to 5 p.m., depending on where you were, on a bridge going over to Washington that had 4 lanes, it came close. It had an average pretty consistently 30 vehicles per lane per minute, close to optimal. And about 10 miles south, also 4 lanes, it was averaging 15 vehicles per minute per lane because of the scrum. It's essentially like if for the yell fire in a crowded theater, you all run instantly to a door and you can't get through, then the throughput per minute there is really low. If you figure out a way to get people to walk briskly through, you get higher throughput. That's what Randal was talking about. A lane has an optimal throughput. So in the case of what we observed, if you had pricing to essentially at the peak of the peak, price off a few people to get rid of the scrum, by the end of the hour, more people would get through in the whole hour because you priced a few off, and then all lanes for the entire 2-hour period would go at about 30 to 33 lanes or vehicles per lane per hour, whereas our observation was that was only happening in certain places because there were actually too many on and off ramps to certain places that were bringing on traffic. So pricing can solve those problems. Short of pricing, I agree with Randal. If you're not talking about value pricing, then I just don't think you're serious about the conversation.
Okay, let's have a hand for Randal O'Toole.